Norman Crockett is hardly a household name. Yet this British intelligence officer was behind one of the most debated decisions made during the Second World War. When London's War Office established Military Intelligence Section 9, MI9, on December 23, 1939, it appointed the 45-year-old Crockett to lead the newly formed organization. Previously heading the London Stock Exchange, he was considered the right kind of man for the role, despite having very little background in military intelligence. MI9's primary purpose was to assist British service members in escaping and avoiding enemy forces. This could involve secretly delivering maps and tiny compasses to prisoners of war held inside Nazi detention camps, or helping downed airmen navigate their way back to Britain or Allied-held territory while evading capture. Though MI9 was a relatively minor branch of British intelligence, by June 1943, Crockett bore the weight of making a critical decision concerning the fate of 80,000 Allied POWs locked inside Italian prison camps. With the Allies preparing to launch an invasion of Italy, Crockett had to determine whether the prisoners should remain where they were and await liberation by Allied forces, or attempt to break out and fight their way to freedom independently. Crockett chose to keep them in place. In an order issued on June 7, 1943, he directed that officers commanding prison camps will ensure that prisoners of war remain within camp. Authority is granted to all officers commanding to take necessary disciplinary action to prevent individual prisoners of war attempting to rejoin their own units. Several considerations shaped this choice. Chief among them was the physical condition of the prisoners, many of whom were thought to be severely malnourished after spending years in confinement. Additionally, the idea of tens of thousands of prisoners wandering freely posed the risk of them becoming easy prey for vengeful Nazis and Italian fascists loyal to Mussolini. Most importantly, Crockett was confident that the Allied push northward through Italy would be rapid, and that British and American soldiers would swiftly reach and free the camps. Why gamble with a mass escape and endanger so many lives? To communicate his directive to the POWs, Crockett embedded a secret coded message within the broadcast script of a widely loved BBC program, The Radio Padre, which was a particular favorite among the imprisoned soldiers. What MI9 astonishingly failed to do, however, was inform British Prime Minister Winston Churchill or his war cabinet of this decision. From the very beginning of negotiations with Italy, Churchill had been explicit about his desire to see POWs returned to Allied hands once the armistice took effect. Article 3 of Italy's surrender agreement clearly stated that prisoners were to be immediately turned over to the Allied commander-in-chief, and none of these may now or at any time be evacuated to Germany. When the armistice was publicly announced on September 8th, the Italian War Ministry honored its commitments and notified 80,000 Allied prisoners that they were free to go. Yet the vast majority stayed behind in their camps, placing themselves at risk of falling under German authority. Churchill was furious when he discovered Crockett's order for the prisoners to stay put, but by that point, it was already too late for many of them. Contrary to Crockett's expectations, the Germans had moved with remarkable speed to seize control of most of the camps, and they were now pursuing the roughly 30,000 prisoners who had ignored the stay-put order and fled. There was nothing left to be done for those still held inside the camps, but Churchill insisted on a plan to save those who had escaped. The man selected to lead this effort was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Tony Simons, who had joined MI9 in 1941 following his service alongside General Ord Wingate in present-day Ethiopia. Operating out of Cairo, Simons directed A Force, the unit responsible for establishing escape routes for Allied prisoners across German-occupied Europe. Called to Allied Forces HQ in Algiers on September 23rd, Simons was tasked with designing a plan to recover the thousands of escaped Allied soldiers wandering across Italy. His resources included troops from Britain's 1st Airborne Division, the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment, 2 SAS, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS. The mission was given the code name Jonquil. Simons set up his command post at Brindisi, a harbor town on the southeastern tip of the Italian peninsula, and arranged a meeting with officers from 2 SAS, who were stationed 75 miles to the northwest in the coastal city of Bari. This elite British Special Forces unit had been founded in North Africa in 1941 by brothers David and Bill Sterling. While posted in Cairo, Simons had often heard stories of their impressive raids on Axis positions deep within enemy-held lands. David Sterling had been taken prisoner in January 1943, but Bill, now commanding 2 SAS, dispatched 2 of his officers, Major Felix Symes and Captain Peter Power, to Brindisi to talk through the rescue plan. They arrived on the evening of September 26th, and for the next 3 hours, Simons thoroughly briefed the SAS officers on the mission's scope. Standing before a large map of Italy's eastern coastline, Simons explained that he had split the region into 4 zones, stretching from Ancona in the north down to Ortona in the south, a span of roughly 100 miles. He outlined 2 SAS's specific role in this way. In each area, 2 parties will go in, one to be dropped by parachute inland with the object of sending all PWs down to the coast, and one party to land by sea to form a beach party to guide, shepherd, and protect the prisoners, and also to supervise their embarkation after having signaled the boats. Each party consisted of 7 soldiers, and waiting offshore would be vessels ready to take the escapees on board. Beyond this, Simons planned to send 2 additional teams into the southernmost of the 4 zones to gather a large concentration of prisoners known to have assembled near the town of Chieti. Each A-Force team would be accompanied by an Italian-speaking operative to extract information from local villagers about where the prisoners might be hiding. Simons recruited some interpreters from the local area, but he also drew on the language capabilities of the American OSS, which maintained a subunit called the Operational Group, OG. The OG's purpose was to organize, arm, and train local populations to resist common enemies. Unlike Britain during the first half of the 20th century, America's diverse melting pot society allowed the OSS to enlist operatives from Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Greek, Norwegian, and other immigrant communities. A standard OG unit consisted of 4 officers and 30 enlisted men. The Italian language unit was led by First Lieutenant Peter Sauro, a 31-year-old born in Yonkers, New York, to Italian immigrant parents. Before the war, he had worked as a tree surgeon. He was of small build and no longer in peak physical condition, but he possessed a solid command of his heritage language. Sauro and his section arrived at OSS headquarters in Algiers on September 8th, the very day Italy formally surrendered. Officially designated as Unit A, 1st Contingent, Operational Group's 2677th Headquarters Company Experimental, Provisional, AFHQ, Sauro's OG was the first unit of its type to be activated, and it spent the following 2 weeks undergoing parachute training. On September 25th, OSS HQ briefed Sauro on the A-Force mission to round up escaped Allied prisoners across Italy. He had just 24 hours to handpick 18 men and prepare them with all necessary equipment. They were assigned the codename Simcoe. After reaching Italy, Sauro's team of Italian speakers traveled by road to Bari, where A-Force had relocated its main base, and where Simons introduced Sauro to the SAS officers. Simons requested that Sauro provide one of his men to each of the 4 SAS parachute teams, and another to each of the 5 groups landing by fishing boat. Sauro and his remaining 9 OG members would carry out a separate parachute operation, independent of the British. Sauro's team departed Bari airfield in the late afternoon of October 2nd for a brief flight north to Catignano, a small village approximately 20 miles inland from Pescara. The parachute drop onto the landing zone went smoothly and without complications. A few hours after Sauro's team had taken off from Bari, a fleet of 8 schooners left the port under the command of SAS Captain Peter Power, a 32-year-old Irishman. Their journey up the eastern coastline took considerably longer than planned due to intense fighting at Termoli, 125 miles north of Bari, where the British 78th Infantry Division and the German 1st Parachute Division had been locked in battle for 3 days. At Termoli, Power and his 12 men traded the schooners for LSIs, landing ships infantry, and pressed on with the mission, finally coming ashore at 2 a.m. on October 7th at Grotta Mare, roughly 100 miles north of Termoli and 50 miles north of Sauro's position. They had landed a few miles south of their intended destination, so they marched through the night in heavy rain to reach the correct stretch of coastline. On the night of October 9th to 10, Power received a signal from a naval dinghy offshore, loaded with supplies. It carried word that the boat would not return until the nights of October 24th, 25, and 25-26, owing to the moon, and that all prisoners must be embarked on these nights. Power's team faced a formidable challenge. Deep within enemy-held territory and completely without wireless sets, which had never been provided despite repeated requests, they had no way of getting out for a full 2 weeks. Power divided his unit into 4 groups. 3 of them fanned out across the surrounding countryside to the north, west, and south in search of prisoners. The 4th group, led by Sergeant Major Bill Marshall, stayed close to the coast to receive prisoners as they were brought in, and to sweep the coastal area for any other escapees. When Power headed north on October 10th, he had 2 men alongside him, Bob Tong, a 20-year-old private from Shropshire, and Sergeant Joe Marino, one of Sauro's OG interpreters. Power carefully recorded their daily progress in his log. On the evening of October 11th, he noted that they had made contact with 14 prisoners, among them 2 South African officers. The following day, British officers arrived at 11 hours and told us there were a number of prisoners near Cordonia. On October 13th, they located 6 more prisoners, and upon reaching the Cordonia area the next day, they found a prisoner who claimed to know the whereabouts of 30 additional men. 9 more were found on October 15th, and on the 16th, they made contact with a communist partisan who was sheltering approximately 30 escapees. On the march back toward the beach, Power gathered even more prisoners, all of whom he gathered into a farmhouse about 2 miles from the coast, under the watch of Tong and Marino. When he reached Marshall's base camp on October 20th, he found that Marshall and his men had themselves collected 34 more POWs during the week. All going well, Power recorded in his journal. All that remained was to hold on and wait for the naval vessels to arrive in 4 days. Their luck ran out the very next morning. A routine German patrol stumbled upon Marshall's base camp, and in the firefight that followed, 2 SAS soldiers were captured and several Germans were killed or wounded. Upon hearing the shooting, Power rushed the POWs from the farmhouse into a nearby ravine, where they stayed hidden throughout the day. Adding to their difficulties, Sergeant Marino had fallen ill, a condition Power delicately described in his journal as delayed VD. Fortunately, the Germans did not mount a follow-up search. Power stationed lookouts along the coastal road, but they spotted nothing suspicious. On October 23rd, SAS teams from the other 3 operational zones began arriving with their own groups of wandering POWs. By the morning of the 24th, Power noted that they had gathered about 300 or 400 prisoners. Many were filled with hope at the thought of being rescued, while others were exhausted, hungry, and short-tempered. Months and years of imprisonment, followed by weeks as fugitives, had worn away much of their military bearing. Eventually, however, the SAS guided them to within a few hundred yards of the beach. The boat was expected to arrive at midnight on October 25th, and Power's instructions to the prisoners were to come in parties not larger than 3. Marino, despite still being weakened by illness, was assigned to act as their dispatcher. Power and Tong set out for the beach at 11:40 p.m. They had barely arrived when they heard bursts of automatic fire, followed by the unmistakable sound of trucks pulling up. Seized by panic, the assembled POWs stampeded back into the hills. Power and Tong sprinted north along the beach away from the gunfire. They had no way of knowing whether the two captured SAS men had disclosed the evacuation plan under interrogation, or whether the Germans had independently discovered the large gathering of prisoners. At daylight, Power and Tong pressed on northward, convinced the operation had been fatally compromised. But that same evening, a Royal Navy launch arrived and took aboard the SAS party, now under Sergeant Major Bill Marshall's command, including Joe Marino. After the chaos of the previous night, only 23 prisoners remained out of the 400 who had been brought to the beach. Power and Tong did not make it back to Allied lines for another month, eventually sailing into Termoli aboard a fishing boat piloted by an Italian aviation officer. They brought 5 POWs with them. Pete Soro found himself in a situation not unlike Power's. After parachuting into Catignano, Soro and his men had gathered 250 fugitives within a single day. The Americans directed the POWs to assemble on the coast at Francavilla, roughly 20 miles due east of Soro's base. A naval vessel was supposed to appear on the nights of October 4th, 6th, 8th, and 10, between midnight and 1 a.m., flashing a signal light every 15 minutes. The agreed password was Jack London. The 3 other SAS parties combing the countryside west and south of Pescara were also steering POWs toward Francavilla. In total, 600 had reached the coast, 350 British, 200 Yugoslav, and 50 American. But as the SAS report recorded, they had signaled for 4 nights, October 4th, 6th, 8th, and 10, without success. Though on the 4th night, what was believed to have been a German MTB, motor torpedo boat, switched its searchlight on them, and there was an exchange of fire. At the same time, a truckload of German troops arrived on the coast road above them. The SAS officer overseeing the evacuation was Captain Raymond Lee, a colorful and thrill-seeking individual who was actually a Frenchman named Raymond Courreau. He had previously earned the Croix de Guerre for his role with the French Foreign Legion during the Norway campaign, but had later deserted. After being arrested and spending time behind bars, he had operated in France as a criminal before joining the SOE and eventually the SAS under his assumed identity. Lee advised the prisoners to split up and make their way through the lines. He also informed them that Termoli, 75 miles away, had been secured by British forces after a 3-day battle, and that traveling overland was now safer than attempting to cross by sea, where they risked being attacked by enemy ships or aircraft. Soro issued similar guidance to half of his OSS team, but he and 4 men continued searching the region for escaped prisoners, briefing each one they found on how to reach Allied lines. On November 3rd, Soro sent 3 more operatives south, while he and 1 remaining companion continued their search. In the end, the 2 were captured by German forces. Captain Lee returned safely to Termoli, and on the night of November 2nd, volunteered to join a search and rescue team aboard an Italian motor torpedo boat. Accompanying him were Captain Richard Lewis, a 26-year-old from Illinois and a Harvard graduate, who would later win the Pulitzer Prize in 1976 for his biography of Edith Wharton, and Augusto Ruffo, an 18-year-old Italian recruited by A-Force, whose father held the title of the 6th Duke of Guardia Lombarda. We were part of an Anglo-American intelligence outfit known in Washington as MISX and in London as MI9, Lewis later wrote in his memoir. In Italy, we had various cover titles. One of those titles was A-Force. The Italian MTB departed Termoli and arrived at the rendezvous point off Silvi, 7 miles north of Pescara. The vessel's captain flashed the recognition signal toward shore, where the A-Force team, including a British Lieutenant Light, spotted it. They had 12 POWs with them. Before anyone could respond to the signal, Light recalled, machine gun fire and 20mm Breda fire were directed at a boat about 1.5 miles offshore. Lewis and Ruffo were below deck, chatting on their bunks when the shooting began. I could see tracer bullets flying and could hear shouts of consternation and rapid orders from above, Lewis recounted. My young Italian friend, in the midst of a sentence, fell forward from the bunk to lie dead on the floor. A bullet had penetrated the side of the boat and entered his back. Lewis pressed himself flat against the floor as bullets ripped through the vessel. When he finally made it up to the deck, he counted the bodies of 6 Italian soldiers. Flames were licking along the railing, Lewis remembered. From out in the blackness, I could hear the desperate appeal of the Italian sailors who had jumped overboard with their lifebelts and were floating about, crying for help. Captain Raymond Lee was also in the water. Despite having been shot in the shoulder, he managed to swim the mile to shore, where he was later found by Light. Lewis also swam to shore, dragging himself up the beach and collapsing into a sand dune. As I watched, exhaustedly, the fire on board reached the torpedo, and the boat blew up. Lewis was now in precisely the same desperate situation as the men he had come to rescue. He headed south and made reasonable progress at first, sustained by the generosity of kind and unquestioning Italian peasants. One villager gave him an old civilian suit, although abandoning his uniform stripped him of his status as a soldier and opened the possibility of being shot as a spy if caught. Lewis felt the worn-out suit offered him better odds of reaching Allied territory than his military fatigues. I was almost within sight of the British lookout posts when I got stuck, Lewis recalled. The long, drawn-out battle of the Sangro River had begun, and the front lines were far too lively for me to attempt to cross. Although the British Eighth Army had secured Termoli on October 6th, the northward push along Italy's eastern coast had become a grueling and costly advance. The Sangro River, 32 miles northwest of Termoli, was finally crossed on November 23rd, but it took another 5 weeks of brutal combat before the 1st Canadian Infantry Division captured the deep-water port of Ortona. While the fighting raged around him, Lewis took shelter in a stone cottage near the village of Creccio, about 12 miles north of the Sangro. While both armies surged forward and fell back in what, from my fretful vantage point, seemed sheer tactical messiness, I made useless little forays toward making my way to safety, only to retreat each time, he later recalled. Lewis finally broke through the lines on December 17th, having swallowed enough raw red wine to give me the requisite courage. Captain Lee, who had made it back to Termoli after a grueling 10-day journey, had reported to A-Force that Lewis had been killed during the MTB attack, making his unexpected return all the more joyful. Simons estimated that approximately 900 former prisoners had made the same perilous journey as Lewis and Lee during the autumn of 1943, some by boat, others on foot. Some had received support from A-Force, while others had managed entirely on their own. It was a deeply disappointing result, given that an estimated 30,000 prisoners had walked out of their camps back in September. In total, it is believed that between 11,000 and 14,000 POWs ultimately reached freedom, either in southern Italy or by crossing the border into neutral Switzerland. Those involved in the A-Force operation were quick to identify the mission's most glaring weakness: the complete absence of radio communication. Colonel Russell B. Livermore of OSS's 2677th Headquarters Company had been unable to reach any of his men on Simcoe, and wrote bluntly in his report, "My reaction, is that hereafter we carry out all our own operations and discontinue these joint ones with the British. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Sterling, commanding officer of 2 SAS, identified several additional shortcomings, including the Navy's extremely erratic timekeeping, which made coordination with shore parties extremely difficult. But his loudest criticism echoed Livermore's. Signaling arrangements were not satisfactory, he wrote. Walkie-talkies between shore and ship might have been useful. Wireless communications with the base would have prevented the ignorance of the parties of the amended orders issued. What pained Sterling most was the sense of a squandered opportunity. Given a simple plan with a reliable means of communication and rendezvous points which could be depended upon, it might have produced far more satisfactory results. In the end, Operation Jonquil remained nothing more than a missed chance, and a tragic one at that.